Good afternoon, everyone. We are so happy that you chose to join us today for our conversation on immigration with Representative Pramila Jayapal. Welcome to Congregation Beth Shalom's Weekend with Hayas. I'm Jody Mizrahi. I'm the chair of the Beth Shalom Immigration and Sanctuary Committee. It has been my pleasure to plan this event with our committee members, Melanie Baker, Rabbi Jill Borden, Gail Koski, Lisa Goldoftis, Chaim Mizrahi, Susan Morgenstern, Matt Saunders, Andrea Soroka-Nar, David Springer, and Marla Zink. During this program, some of these wonderful individuals will be serving as moderators and then later as facilitators in our action breakout rooms. I also want to acknowledge and thank the many organizations that joined as co-sponsors of this event. The enthusiasm to join us is a great representation of how our Jewish community stands in solidarity with one another and its commitment to refugees and asylum seekers. Our thanks to our co-sponsors, ADL Pacific Northwest, Beit Haverim, Congregation Etzor Hillel of University of Washington, Jewish Coalition for Immigrant Justice Northwest, Jewish Family Service, Jewish Federation, Kadima, Kavanagh Cooperative, Kol Ami, a Center for Jewish Life, Temple Beth Am, Temple B'nai Torah, and Temple Dehersh Sinai. We are also honored today to have with us Elizabeth Mondelman Hayes' Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy, and Rabbi Will Berkowitz, the CEO of Jewish Family Service, Seattle. They too will be facilitating a breakout room later today. Before we begin our program, I'd like to briefly explain the format that we'll be following. First, you may have noticed that everyone has been muted, and because of the large number of participants, we'll be keeping that function on until we get into smaller groups. Soon we'll begin our conversation with Representative Jayapal, and that will be a 50-minute question and answer session regarding issues related to immigration policy and advocacy. The immigration questions will be from you, the participants, and we ask you to put your inquiries in the private chat with our event administrator, Melanie. The immigration questions will then be asked to Congresswoman by one of our moderators. We hope to be able to address as many of your questions about immigration policy advocacy as we can, and we'll do our best during this limited time. After our conversation with Representative Jayapal, we'll move into breakout rooms and to take action for immigrant justice together. We'll then be, at that time, you'll be directed on how to select a breakout room. I know everyone, including myself, is anxious to get this program underway. Now I'd like you to meet David Springer, who has the honor to introduce our keynote speaker.
Hello, Pramila. We're honored today to celebrate asylum seekers and refugees, as well as International Women's Day and Women's History Month, with such a strong women's leader as yourself. Pramila Jayapal is the congressman from the 7th Congressional District in the state of Washington, who represents many of the attendees here today. As the people's advocate, wife, and mother, she has presented the truth when no matter who tells it, and justice, no matter who's against it or for us. Although she's suffered defeats, she has never been defeated. For over 2 decades, Pramila has spoken up for immigrant justice. As founder for One America, the largest immigrant rights organization in Washington state. She is the head of the Progressive Caucus in the House of Representatives, as well as serving on the House Judiciary Committee, where she is vice chairman of the Immigration Subcommittee. I want to extend a heartfelt welcome and thank you, Pramila, for being with us today. I'll begin our conversation by asking the first question. seeking justice for refugees and asylum seekers. Can you tell us about the roadmap to freedom? I know that there are many steps in this roadmap. My parents themselves immigrated from Nazi Germany, overcoming many obstacles to gain entry into the United States. They felt safer, but never accepted. They are smiling down on us today as we work to create a more humane immigration system. What do you see as the legislative steps toward implementing the humane roadmap to justice, and how can we, as members of many faith-based groups and Jewish organizations, support that roadmap? I turn it over to you, Pramila.
Thank you so much, David, for that introduction, and also for anybody who probably most of you don't know, but when I came back to this country with a child that was born at 1 pound, 14 ounces, 26 and a half weeks, just a couple of months into their life, I was looking for the most humane and compassionate pediatrician I could find, and guess who that was? That was David Springer, only to later find out that our politics completely aligned as well, which didn't surprise me at all. So David, thank you for looking after Janak in those really critical years and for all your work so far. And then Jody, I just have to say you are such a wonderful leader in the community, and I'm so thrilled that you've passed that on to your wonderful son, Joe Mizrahi, who's a dear friend and a wonderful leader in our community. Thank you for everything you are doing. And what an amazing group of organizations. So I really want to thank Congregation Beth Shalom and also all of the organizations that are a part of this today. I'm kind of amazed that we have 120 plus participants on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. And I think it just goes to show how deeply critical the values of comprehensive, just, humane immigration reform are, and how important it is in this time that we have your voices. So I think many of you know that I came to this country alone by myself at the age of 16. As David said, went on to start One America and lead it for 12 years. And so have worked on immigration policy really for decades now. Now in Congress, I'm one of only 14 naturalized citizens to serve in the United States Congress. And I can tell you that while getting the last president out of office and reversing his hateful immigration policies is absolutely critical, that is not enough. What we have been fighting for decades really is to fix a system that was intentionally broken. It is broken, but it was intentionally broken. It is actually littered with racist, xenophobic qualities in the way that immigration has been structured in this country. And yet, at the same time, the incredible contradiction, of course, is that so many of us see the United States as a beacon of hope, and it has been a beacon of hope for immigrants from around the world. And so this is the tension that we have battled with in this country for a very long time. As we begin a new presidential administration, it is finally, I believe, the moment, because the last president really crystallized what happens when immigrants are used as a political football at the highest level. And so I think we are finally at a place where we have generated a lot of support across the country to leave behind our country's decades-long history of criminalizing immigration and separating families. That is especially true in this moment, where immigrants are on the front lines of this pandemic, working as essential workers, and largely being treated as expendable, even as they're called essential. They're left out of most of the relief that Congress has provided. We've made more steps forward in this package that we're going to pass on Tuesday, but we're nowhere near what we need to do. And so when I thought about what is important for us to put on the table right now, it was to have a North Star, a roadmap, a progressive vision for immigration reform that regardless of what pieces of immigration might go forward, and I'm sure somebody will have a question about piecemeal versus comprehensive and what's the strategy here, but regardless of what we're doing, that we would always have a basic set of principles around what are all the pieces of the immigration system that need to be reformed in order for us to truly have justice. And what is the framework that puts immigrants at the center as beautiful, loving, contributing human beings without whom our society would simply not be able to function? A positive, resilient view of immigrants. And so that is why I'm so proud to have introduced the Roadmap to Freedom. We introduced it with members from the Hispanic Caucus, the Black Caucus, and the Asian Pacific American Caucus. And obviously, as you heard, I'm the chair of the Progressive Caucus and the task force lead for the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, because what we understand is that immigration affects so many different folks in so many different ways. And it is Africa, it is Asia, it is Latin America, it is literally around the world that people are coming, and all of those people need to be recognized. This Roadmap to Freedom gives communities who have been fighting for dignity, family unity, and an end to draconian enforcement something to finally fight for, a core set of principles that is our North Star for a humane and just immigration system. So quickly, what it covers in terms of these principles is, first, it says we must have a fair immigration process that establishes a roadmap to citizenship for the full 11 million while centering family unity and promoting and preserving diversity. Second, it welcomes immigrants by supporting integration efforts and ensuring access to critical public services. As someone who helped create the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs in Seattle through our organizing at One America, I know just how important it is to provide our newest Americans with essential integration aspects such as employment attainment, language access, civic engagement. And I know that many of the co-sponsors of today's event have been part and parcel of making that a successful program in Seattle and around the country. Third, the resolution brings an understanding that we have to uphold the rights of all workers. We know that immigrants across America are working on the front lines of this pandemic, keeping our country running, and yet not getting treated fairly. That has to change, not only during this pandemic, but forever. Fourth, the Roadmap to Freedom says that we have to invest in border policy that protects the rights of communities in the borderlands. Not only do we need to stop building walls, but we need to end the mass militarization of that border region while upholding the civil rights of those who call it home. And finally, core to the resolution, our vision creates a just way to uphold immigration laws. This includes by prioritizing the freedom of immigrants, investing in humane and community-based alternatives to detention for those that need it, which, by the way, is incredibly cost-effective, as well as the right thing and the moral thing to do. And third, creating scalable consequences for enforcement. Detention is not the answer. Deportation is not the answer. And yet we have criminalized so many tens of thousands of people, about 45,000 people every single night are held in mostly for-profit private detention facilities just when they're waiting for a bond hearing or when they're waiting for their papers to be processed as immigrants or refugees. So we have to modernize that system and have reasonable, humane, and dignified options on the table that don't rip families apart. As we review any immigration legislation in this upcoming session, the Roadmap to Freedom will be that visionary document. It will be that North Star. And if we follow it, I believe we will finally establish a just, humane immigration system. Now, all of this comes at a time in which Congress is looking at making sweeping changes to immigration laws. And for far too long, Congress has approached immigration reform through this insane set of trade-offs. We'll trade you protections for some in exchange for increased enforcement and taking away the rights of many others. Now is the time to move away from that harmful dynamic and put forth this roadmap or any set of legislation that is fair, equitable, centers family unity, and humanitarian protection. That's really the only way that we're going to eliminate the systemic injustices that have plagued the system for decades. Now, I'm sure we're going to talk today about other legislative priorities. We have a lot to do in the House and the Senate. We have very narrow margins, and we're going to take every opportunity we can to pass bold reform of our immigration system. President Biden has delivered on his promise that, frankly, our movement, our progressive movement across the country, spent so long last year bringing to him and working through in task forces a set of commitments. Those commitments are contained in this day one bill, the U.S. Citizenship Act. And it is a true testament to the power of organizers who have made this a priority. So this bill, the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021, was introduced by Congresswoman Sanchez and Senator Menendez. It does have an expansive and relatively quick roadmap to citizenship. It addresses the massive immigration backlog. It restores our refugee program, and it protects streamers and TPS recipients. So in the coming weeks, I'm also going to reintroduce my Dignity for Detained Immigrants Act with Senator Booker, which would completely reform our approach to detention, end our dependence on immigration detention, and really transform our detention system. There's a lot of other pieces of legislation, but I want to get to the rest of your questions. So I'll stop there and turn it back to you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Jayapal. This is Marla Zink. Dovetailing with what you were just talking about, can you tell us whether you feel that President Biden's U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 meets what's in the roadmap to freedom? Will it pass? And if not, what can be done while Democrats have control of both houses and the presidency?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I do believe it meets many of the pieces, not everything, because it doesn't include, for example, detention, but it has many of the major pieces within it. The only thing I would say is that the issue where we always get stuck on immigration legislation is around the criminal bars. What are criminal bars? It's who's excluded. Who's excluded from whatever relief we put in there. And typically what happens is, because we've already created a system where a bunch of people were criminalized just for shoplifting for food, for example, or a leather jacket, and then they get, because of it's a misdemeanor conviction, unlike Washington State, where we changed that to be 364 days. If you got sentenced, it was 364 instead of 365. That's a small wonky change, but that meant that people weren't eligible for deportation. But in most parts of the country, that is not the case. So you have these criminal labels on people, and the consequences are deportation regardless of what you've done. So on each of these bills, and with the Biden bill is unfortunately no exception, it's better than what we were able to get into the Dream and Promise Act last year, the HR 6 bill that we passed in the House, but it still excludes people based on a set of criminal convictions. And what President Biden was willing to do actually was to put in a broad waiver that would be very narrowly used, but would be given to the Secretary of Homeland Security. And that would have been revolutionary. And unfortunately, before the bill was even introduced, that got bargained down. So now that broad waiver is not there. That said, I have signed on to the bill. I will be working to push it forward. And I do believe that it is a very, very important step forward, and we'll try to make it better in all the ways that we can before it gets to the floor. Oh, and you asked me about the possibility of success. So let me just say that I get frustrated when the conversation becomes that we can't do something before we've even tried, which unfortunately, I think with this bill, there's a little bit of that out there. We are going to push incredibly hard. I believe we will pass it through the House. The challenge will be not to weaken it. And then we have to put pressure on the Senate to get rid of the filibuster. My personal opinion, I don't think you can do anything if you don't get rid of the filibuster, because most of these things don't qualify for budget reconciliation. So we will have to find a way to get it through and to be able to do it with a simple majority, because Republicans are continuing to fall on the sword of Trump and continuing to use immigrants in terrible xenophobic ways. And I just think we're unlikely to get 10 Republican votes. So that is my hope, that we get rid of the filibuster and that we are able to pass critical pieces of legislation like this one.
My name is Andrea Sirocco-Nar. Thank you for being here and for your incredible advocacy. 1090, Ending Private Prisons, is in the Washington State Senate. What are your thoughts on this bill and the possibility of ending private detention in Washington State? We know that you have been to detention centers and have seen how people are treated inside. I'm also part of the Jewish Coalition for Immigrant Justice Northwest, which has been involved in Wisen's Fair Fight Bond Fund to bond people out of detention. Why should detention centers be shut down? And it would be great if you could tell us more about the Dignity for Detained Immigrants Act.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Wisen has done such amazing work, and what a great coalition in the state. And you all have been at the center of so many of these fights for immigrant justice over the years. So I'm very grateful to you. I don't know that bill. I need to go look at it. I probably should know it, but I haven't been able to track state legislation in the same way. However, I do remember last year texting Joe Wynn, Senator Joe Wynn, and saying, hey, you guys should do this in the state. So I guess that happened. Assuming that it matches with these principles, I'm really in favor of this. Over 15 years ago now, 10 years, 12 years ago, we did the first report on human rights abuses at One America in the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma. And then we continued to focus on detention and shutting down private detention centers. Why should we do it? Because two big reasons. Just from a pure cost perspective, if you want to look at the economics of it, we spend enormous amounts of money on these private contractors. What happened is, as people started to phase out jails and really on the criminal justice side started to move away from locking people up, those same contractors said, hey, we'd like to still continue to make money on incarceration, so we're going to move into the immigration detention space. And so it costs a ridiculous amount of money, taxpayer money, to keep people locked up in these detention centers. And really, there is no reason to do that. And that sort of leads to the second piece, which is, what is the moral and humane way to deal with a lot of these folks that are in detention centers? The vast majority of them have never been convicted of a crime, much less charged of a crime. So they are literally there awaiting their civil immigration proceedings. So why don't we use alternatives to detention, which are just a couple of cents on the dollar, humane, community-based alternatives, which are proven to be almost 100% effective in all the tests that have been done, experiments that have been done with community-based alternatives. So that is my belief of what we should do. And so I think that we really don't need these private detention centers. They have terrible standards of care. There is no incentive for them to provide medical health, to make sure that people have decent food. The worst example most recently of this, of course, was the Irwin County Detention Center, which I led the charge on, the forced medical procedures that were being done on women in Irwin County. We got doctors to testify, attorneys. I mean, it was an amazing group of people. I took a delegation of members of Congress to Irwin. I passed a resolution with every single Democrat and 8 Republicans condemning what was happening in Irwin. And of course, our Native American brothers and sisters and Black brothers and sisters know that this is not an isolated incident in US history of forced medical procedures. So that was the worst example recently, but let me tell you, that is not limited to one detention center. The Dignity for Detained Immigrants bill really transforms the detention center by transitioning out all private for-profit detention centers over the course of 3 years. It puts in place a whole set of alternatives to detention and says that these alternatives should be utilized in these cases, which would essentially take most of that population out of the detention center. It also says you can't detain vulnerable populations, pregnant women, elderly people, people with deep medical conditions, those kinds of things. And it says no more solitary confinement. People are held in solitary confinement there in these detention prisons. And then finally, it really invests in standards. So if somebody has to be held, then what are the standards and conditions? And if you don't meet those, then guess what? You don't get to continue to operate.
Thank you for that. The next question is, many individuals and organizations are comfortable talking about refugees and asylum seekers, but often steer away from talking about undocumented immigrants. How does one explain the need to advocate for undocumented immigrants? Where do you think this discomfort stems from, and how can people move through it to be stronger advocates?
Wow, what a great question. I think the discomfort comes from the language and the changes that both parties in this country, Democrats and Republicans, have been responsible for creating a language of criminalization. And this goes back quite some time, but certainly most notably to 1996 and welfare reform that was passed under Democratic President Bill Clinton, but really criminalized immigrants in massive ways. And when that happened, it was sort of an acceptance that, oh, the presence of illegality is a criminal offense, when in fact immigration law is a civil offense. You don't get an attorney if you are here in this country on immigration status. You have to be able to afford one, or you have to have a really great organization like some of the ones that are here today to represent you. But 98% of people that go through the immigration system go through pro se, and yet none of that was ever explained. And the immigration system has been this compilation of pieces kind of piled on top of each other, but many exclusionary and racist policies embedded in those pieces that were really never taken on as a whole narrative. The exclusion of Chinese Americans, the inability for Indian Americans until so recently actually to marry US citizens, all of those things. And so I think that's a lot of the roots of it. But if you go even deeper, it's just this fear of people who are not like us. And I think refugees are perhaps seen as more sympathetic because they come out of war. So do undocumented immigrants, by the way. But the process for refugee resettlement is a much more defined and stringent process. So people feel like, okay, they've gone through some sort of a process. Whereas if you're from El Salvador or Guatemala or wherever, and you're just escaping violence and rape and horrible things in your country, and you make it north and you come across the border, somehow that is seen as not following the law, not following the rules. But what people don't realize is there are no good laws here. I mean, we have taken advantage and exploited undocumented immigrants in this country for so long without providing a real path to citizenship. So when I talk to people who are uncomfortable about undocumented immigrants, I start by asking them what fruits and vegetables they eat. I ask them if they've stayed in a hotel recently. Of course, this is pre-COVID. I ask them who cleans their home. I ask them, all the questions. I ask them, who their kids play with in school. And when you start doing that, and when you explain to people that the vast majority of undocumented immigrants have lived in this country for more than 15 years with no ability to transfer to any kind of a legal working system because there is not one, or when you explain that a Filipino immigrant has to wait for 22 years for their adult child to come to this country, and you talk to somebody and you say, what would you do if you could not bring your child into the country for 22 years, and somewhere in that process they became an adult? They turned 18 and they no longer qualify. Now they turn 21, they really don't qualify. What would you do? Would you not bring them in to stay with you somehow? And I kind of go through those human experiences that we have and have people think about what it is they're doing in their daily life that is touched by and provided for by undocumented immigrants. It doesn't always work, but it's helpful. And then I always have some economic statistics around for people who just can't get there. And I say, okay, so then what's your solution? Should we deport everybody? Is that the solution? And then usually they say, no, we should just have a process. And I'm like, great, we agree. We should have a process. Exactly.
Thanks, Congresswoman Jayapal. I'm Matt Saunders. I'm another member of the CBS Immigration Justice Group. The next question is, we are in a situation right now where Israel's immigration policy is discriminating against Black and Brown Jews, specifically in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Nigeria. We're wondering if there's anything that the American government or anything we can do in our country to help these persecuted people immigrate to the US, similar to what was done to help out Soviet Jewry.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I think that for the last 4 years under the inhumane policies of the Trump administration, frankly, the US has lost a lot of our moral high ground in advocating for humanitarian policies around the world. And so I really believe that we need to rebuild that moral high ground at home to set an example for our allies abroad. And I know that the Biden administration is starting to do that, including his executive order on rebuilding and enhancing programs to resettle refugees and planning for the impact of climate change on migration. But I think it's really important for the Biden administration to hear from the American Jewish community, to ask them to urge Israel to be more welcoming and accepting refugees from all over the world, particularly those with Jewish roots and with ties to Israel. I think that is a very, very important piece of advocacy that we're going to have to do. But we do recognize that there are a lot of, and we just had Secretary of State Anthony Blinken come and talk to us. And this was one of the issues that we pushed with him, is just the overall human rights around the world and how much ground we've lost in the United States, not to mention not just with our foreign policy, but with our insurrection that happened on January 6th. So I think the most important thing here is pressure on the Biden administration around this issue from the American Jewish community, which has a very strong political force in this country. And I think that, there's certainly examples of how to do this. It's just a question of will.
Hi, Representative Jayapal. I'm Liz Mandelman, Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at HIAS. Thank you so much for all you do, and thank you so much to your staff as well for all they do. I feel like you partially just addressed this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I feel like it's important to raise up. Nearly a month ago now, Secretary of State Blinken announced that the administration intended to increase the number of refugees admitted to the US this year from the historic low of 15,000 to 62,500. The administration has yet to formalize this increase, which has resulted in nearly 700 flights of refugees being canceled for the month of March. So I wanted to hear from you why you think it's imperative to sign this increased number, and also what you think the best advocacy we can be doing right now is.
Well, it's exactly what you said, and thank you so much for HIAS's work. I deeply appreciate it. I think we have trauma happening around the world. We have people still in refugee camps. I worked in a refugee camp in Thailand in 1989, the largest refugee camp along the borders of Laos and Cambodia and Thailand. I've been there. I know what that is. And for people who have been in refugee camps for a decade more, we absolutely have created so much of a gut punch in the reduction of numbers of refugees that we're admitting. And so it is absolutely crucial that the Biden administration moves very quickly on this. I will say we have been pushing them on it. I know it's a top priority of the House to increase that number, sign that into law and increase the number of refugees. In their defense, there's so much that has to be done so quickly. And I think that they're probably struggling with that. But we actually just talked to them about trying to get it done quickly, because the other thing that I know HIAS is dealing with and other refugee resettlement organizations are dealing with is you had to lay off a lot of people. Now you've got to, ramp all the way up again, which is not easy to be able to get these numbers in. So we need to get the funding reestablished. We need to make sure that we are putting the limits on quickly so that we don't delay these flights a day longer.
Hi, Congresswoman Jayapal. My name is Melanie. I'm the Engagement Director at Beth Shalom, and I will be fielding to you some of our other questions from various participants today. So we did get a few questions about the COVID pandemic and how that intersects with some of the issues we're talking about. So a couple of questions about why are immigrants not being tested for COVID so they can be helped and also kept from spreading the pandemic? What is the administration's response to claims made by the governor of Texas regarding people coming from crossing the border would have COVID?
So in terms of, sorry, was that it, Melanie?
Yeah,
Oh,
thank you.
Okay, so in terms of testing, this has been something we have been saying, look, even if you don't share our morals and our values about everybody being able to get a test regardless of citizenship, you should at least be worried about public health, right? And make sure that every single person is tested because it protects everybody's public health. And so all I can say is that, you know, Donald Trump never took the pandemic seriously. He never did what was necessary. He was engaged in his racist, xenophobic diatribes about immigrants carrying this. And they refused in many instances to make testing available, you know, to immigrant populations in many Republican states. But it is still an issue even in Washington state, in terms of farm workers being able to get tested, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities being able to get tested. And I can promise you, I raise this with the governor every single week on our weekly call that we've had for the last year. I'm sure he's sick of me, but I think the thing is that it's not out of necessarily a lack of desire. And he's done some very good things, including prioritizing multi-generational households over 50 for vaccinations is very important because of course that's largely immigrant families. But the problem is we're relying on a healthcare system that is exclusionary. I mean, even before COVID hit, we had 80 million people who were uninsured or underinsured. And this is why I've proposed the Medicare for All bill. And, you know, we're going to be introducing it in a couple of weeks. This is not disconnected from what's happening because the vast majority of people who are Black, Brown, Indigenous, poor, and working class do not have access to healthcare. So where are they supposed to get their tests? They're afraid that they're going to have fees, which many of them do, even though they're not supposed to. We passed in our COVID package that everyone should get a test regardless of citizenship status. But that's not the system we have right now. And in many states, at the same time, there was this public charge rule, which we managed to sort of crush a little bit, but the fear that somebody was going to be picked up by ICE when they go to get their tests, all of that was there. So that was a big part of this last year. But this year, what disappoints me, I'll be very frank, is that there is still, even within the Democratic Party and Democratic caucus, particularly in the Senate, there is still, but even some in the House, there is still a reluctance to assure that every immigrant gets tested, gets healthcare, gets vaccines. It's part of this demonizing of immigrants. And so that is what we're continually working on. And that's why when you talk about the southern border, you know, we've had amendments in the Judiciary Committee on various bills where the Republicans are like, we got to test every, you know, immigrant that comes across the southern border. But the way they're doing it is they're taking money out of some other big immigration priority and they're villainizing immigrants as being the carriers of disease. Every one of us should be tested. We're all potential carriers of the disease because that's what an epidemic is. So it's a complicated issue. And I think before I came to Congress, I think many of you know, and I really missed President Obama so much over the last 4 years, but I think many of you may know, I called President Obama the deporter in chief. I called out President Clinton for IRA, which is one of the most horrible immigration laws that was passed along with welfare reform. And so I just think that we still have work to do to get both of our parties on board fully. And President Biden has taken big steps forward because the movement has taken big steps forward, and because the vitriol against immigrants for the last 4 years, the caging of kids, the separation of families, all the horrific things we saw in some odd way have perhaps shifted the balance so people feel more comfortable about speaking out for immigrants. So in spite of all the anti-immigrant rhetoric, the polling has never been higher in terms of support for immigrants. But it affects these things, like who gets these checks? You know, I fought to make sure everyone got a survival check, especially if you have an ITIN number. Can you imagine you're paying taxes into a system you're never going to get anything from, and you still don't get your survival check? And in fact, in the first package, you didn't even get a survival check if you were married to, if you were a US citizen, but you were married to an undocumented immigrant, you didn't get a survival check, which was crazy. At least we fixed that, and we fixed it retroactively in December. And this time we have checks for mixed status families. Yay us. But we should have included ITINs too. And we weren't able to do that. So that is the dynamic we operate in, and it's why your work is so incredibly important, not just here in Seattle, but across the country.
Thank you for that, Congresswoman. And speaking of those stimulus checks, that leads to another question we got, which is for anyone here on this call today who feels that they don't need their stimulus check and feels that there are immigrants and refugees out there that could use it. I will put some links in the chat that our various partners would say would benefit from that money, but what recommendations do you have for where our money can go?
Oh, well, I think you're probably going to call out all the same organizations that I would. There are organizations, including One America, including I think the Wisen Coalition has put forward. I don't know if it's a fund or a list of organizations that have come together, but we've advertised those all along the way. And I would say keep it local. If you don't want to go to an organization, I bet you know some immigrants that you could give that money to yourself, the people who help you every day, the farm worker organizations who will absolutely distribute that money and make sure that it gets out.
Thank you for that. And a few more groups of questions that we're seeing. And apologies, we won't get to everyone's questions today, but thank you so much for putting them in the chat. You did speak a little bit about working with the Democratic caucus. And so we've gotten a few questions about working with fellow Democrats and also working with Republicans. So you mentioned that some provisions, parts of bills were bargained out before the bills were even submitted. So with whom in the Democratic caucus is this bargaining happening, and what are their concerns? And then zooming out farther to the Democratic and Republican parties, how important is it for Republicans to be part of these reforms? And how is that looking going into 2022?
Well, the challenge is in moderate or conservative districts, districts that a Democrat won, but that Trump also won. And there are people who are very worried, particularly around the criminal bars. That's always the issue it comes down to, who's included, who's excluded. And so that is the people who introduced the US Citizenship Act made those choices along with Speaker Pelosi. In fact, I called Speaker Pelosi to say, I don't think we should bargain away from ourselves before we've even introduced the bill. But I think her concern was around keeping the House majority. I'll just be very frank, and not having people vote on something that's then going to be used by Republicans in an ad. So I think that's one issue with the
I do not wish to appear, and I am. Okay.
I think that's one issue on the Democratic side. But I will say the other issue is that immigration is complex. It is a I think I just got muted, but I think I unmuted myself. I feel very comfortable talking about the immigration system. I know it really well. I can go on Fox News, I can take on Tucker Carlson and Lou Dobbs and whoever else. But there are a lot of people for whom we just need to continue to educate. We need to continue to give people the best arguments. We need to get them comfortable enough
It's
with the system.
unmuted, so I have no idea. I don't want anyone.
We just have to get them comfortable enough with the system that they're able to lean into something instead of running away from it. So we're working on that. In terms of the Republicans, there was a time when I thought that Republicans would go along with us. And in fact, we will be bringing 2 bills to the floor in not next week, but the week after. The Dream and Promise Act, that was HR 6 from last year, and the Farm Worker Modernization Act, which both of those were bipartisan in the last Congress. And I'm going to be really interested to see how many bipartisan votes we still get. We're going to bring pretty much almost the exact same bills to the floor. So we will see whether we have Republicans who are willing to go along with that. The challenge right now is that many of the people, this is not an ordinary time, that many of the people that I serve with in the House on the other side are people who still don't believe that Joe Biden is the legitimately elected president of the United States. They still believe that the insurrection didn't really happen and that Donald Trump was not responsible for inciting it. They are people that go to white supremacist conferences proudly and interact with the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and others. And so they are people that bring guns onto the floor. They are people that every day I wake up in the morning and I think, if I live another day, that will be a really great day. And so I think it is a very complex environment that we're operating in. And the whole notion of bipartisanship is hawk-marked with a lot of shots, a lot of holes. That said, we'll continue to try to do what we can to work in a bipartisan way. But as you saw with the COVID relief package, that is a bipartisan package that 70% of the country supports, but not a single Republican supported. And so we may have to continue to do work on issues like immigration, civil rights, voting rights, getting money out of politics, a $15 minimum wage, that are policies that Republicans, Democrats, and independents across the country support, but we may not get a Republican in Congress to support.
Thank you for that, Congresswoman. And we've gotten a few questions about, today we're thinking about immigrants and refugees who are marginalized in our society. And we've gotten a few questions about folks who are further marginalized for other identities they have. For example, being trans, or also being Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So one question is, are there provisions for transgender or non-binary people in the Dignity for Detention? Or just more generally, what are we doing about the exclusion of trans and non-binary folks?
Well, I don't know if everyone knows this, but I'm the, sorry, there's some feedback there, I'm not sure. I don't know if everyone knows this, but I'm the proud mother of a trans kid. There are 3 of us in Congress that have trans kids, so we figure we have a sort of a caucus now. And so absolutely, I have paid special attention to that even before my kid came out as trans. But in Dignity, it is absolutely incorporated in there throughout in multiple ways. So LGBTQ communities are vulnerable communities. They are also pulled out in terms of specific needs that are there within detention. Gender identity is kind of pulled all the way through. And in fact, when we did a hearing on dignity for detained immigrants in the last Congress, we had a really powerful testimony from a trans individual who testified about their experience in detention. It was really powerful. So we've continued to highlight that. And of course, we did just pass the Equality Act on the House floor, which would provide protections to LGBTQ folks on all these different arenas, housing and all arenas. And the thing that the Republicans just kept going to, it was such a hurtful floor debate, to be totally frank, was trans people. They've realized they can't win on LGBTQ. And so they're focused on trans people. And specifically, all of a sudden, my Republican colleagues seem to care about women's sports and women being able to be represented, and somehow making the claim that trans identity is going to hurt women's sports. So it's our Democratic caucus is very united on this issue. I'm really proud to say, and we're not going to let the culture wars get in the way of anything that we're doing, and we're going to continue to fight for LGBTQ communities on every level.
Thank you so much for that. And we've just gotten amazing questions in the chat today. So apologies, we don't have time to get to all of them. In fact, we are going to hear our last question now. And then after that last question and the response, we are going to hear from our Rabbi Borden and remarks from Jewish Family Service and Highest before we move into the breakout room portion, where we'll actually be able to learn more and take action. So just so you all know what's coming up next. And we will hear from Andrea Sirocco-Nar for our last question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our local Jewish community and institutions are principally run by white Ashkenazi Eastern European Jews who have a long history of migration and faced immigration restriction. How can we be allies and take action for immigrant rights?
Well, that's the perfect question for an activist. And so I think what you're doing today, learn about the system, get as much information as you can so that you can counter a lot of the myths, learn about the history, but also root everything in those very experiences that your community has and can go back to as personal experiences of trauma, of resilience, of movement across borders, and of safety and security in this country. And I think that rooting everything in those personal experiences and trying to get people to relate to them is the most important. So information generally about the immigration system, but also tell your story, tell the story of your parents or your grandparents, and see if you can find common ground. Second, reach out to people that don't think like you. Find the places where there are people that don't think like you. Maybe it's your family members in other states. Maybe it's people that you never raised this issue with because you know you don't agree. Try raising it and see what happens. Because I think that as long as we keep talking to people that just agree with us, we don't necessarily build our movement. So maybe there are ways that your congregations and communities can talk to people who don't share your views, even here in the Seattle region. I think that there are a lot of people that we could probably talk to and get on board, or at least listen and be able to figure out where the blocks are so we can organize better. Third, there are a number of bills, Dignity for Detained Immigrants, the Pro-Kid Act, which I just introduced last week with Senator Gillibrand, which is an essential layer of oversight for all immigrant children in any kind of custody, the Roadmap to Freedom. We would love for you to endorse those bills and go out and get champions across the country, here in the state and across the country, to sign on to those bills and to be able to explain to them what they are and why they're so important. So including it in your official advocacy list would be fantastic. And then, of course, what you're doing, which is at the state level and the community level, providing that help, that relief that you do already, and that advocacy for change to happen as close to home as possible. It helps us to build the movement across the country. That's how we got 15 started. And I believe that that's how we will continue to make strides forward that matter in significant ways to people. And since that was the last question, I also just want to thank Rabbi Jill for her counsel and wisdom and friendship over the last many years, and to all of the incredible leaders that have been here on this call with us, and all the incredible organizations that have been here on this call with us. Thank you for just never giving up, and thank you for believing in a vision that goes so much beyond any individual person and is really about this collective, this human collective that is filled with pain, yes, difficulty, yes, but also love, generosity, resilience, compassion, and caring. You are truly the epitome of that, and I thank you.
We are so delighted to have so many people joining us for so many different communities today. And Representative Jayapal, really an honor to have you with us and to share so frankly. We're very grateful for your national leadership on behalf of refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers, and all those seeking shelter and understanding in their plight, and realize how critical it is that we have a compassionate system with justice and legal protection and possibility for the millions in need. As you can see today from the large number of Seattle Jewish organizations gathered here, this is an issue critical to the Seattle Jewish community. We are all immigrants and the children of immigrants. We are incredibly grateful for the opportunities we have been afforded on these shores and passionately believe these should continue to be available for those seeking them now. We are just a little bit less than 3 weeks away from the beginning of Passover. As taught is in the Mishnah and made its way to the Haggadah, many of us in 3 weeks will be reciting the words, B'chol dor v'dor hayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim. In every generation, a person is obligated to see themselves as though they came forth from Egypt. Each and every year, we are to re-experience having been enslaved and oppressed in a country we need to leave, and experience coming out of that narrow place and being able to leave it and enter a new home full of potential, possibility, and the promise of freedom from oppression. We are to experience it each and every year so we can do something with that memory, to let that memory of how horrible that experience was inform how we treat people today needing to flee their homes to find a safe new home where they can feed their families and live safely. As we learn in the book of Leviticus, we are to love them as ourselves, for we too were in that position in the land of Egypt. Beth Shalom was very honored today to have convened such a large contingent of the Seattle Jewish community for this critical conversation and the advocacy we can do together. We hope everyone on this call will stay for advocacy breakout room portion of the program in 10 minutes and will continue to advocate and take action after today's program. We'll be sending out an email with follow-up actions for everyone who registered today and encourage you to subscribe to HIAS and all the different organizations we mentioned to their websites and listservs to stay on top of what recommended action we can be able to take on behalf of incredible and much needed immigration and refugee advocacy and change. We look forward to continuing to partner together as a Jewish community on this issue. This afternoon, we are delighted to have with us representation from National HIAS and HIAS's local partner, Jewish Family Services of Seattle. At this point in our program, we're going to turn to Liz Mandelbaum and Rabbi Will Berkovitz, CEO of JFS, to share some remarks. Among different work JFS and HIAS have done together on behalf of refugees and immigrants is together they partnered to sue the Trump administration and won a lawsuit specifically advocating for refugees. Rabbi Will Berkovitz is known to many of you on this call as a local Washington leader and CEO of JFS Seattle. He'll be the first to share some comments. Liz Mandelbaum is HIAS's Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy. In her role, she advocates on behalf of refugees to member of Congress and other government agencies, and will be our second to share just a few brief remarks. We're delighted to have both of you with us today.
Hi, thanks so much, Rabbi Borden. I also want to thank Congresswoman Jayapal, Beth Shalom, all of the folks who partnered today, and specifically I want to thank HIAS and really all of you who care about this work and the people and the lives that we're trying to support. I think the big question that we're grappling with is who do we want to be as a country right now? We have a tremendous amount of repair that needs to be done within our own borders, but also repair in terms of how other people across this planet view us. I think it's important to just contextualize a few pieces. There are 71 million forcefully displaced people in the world today, 71 million people. And that's more than the population of France. So last year, the US resettled roughly, not even rough, I think roughly 15,000 people, which is about how many people could fit into Key Arena. That's the entirety of our country. There are 328 million people in our country, and we brought into this country less than the amount, or roughly the amount, that could fit into Key Arena. Washington State brought in 1,500 people. And just to again contextualize, Washington State, which was the second highest behind California, that's roughly the size of could fit into Hirsch Sinai's their sanctuary. So while it is true that the Biden administration is trying to increase the number from 15,000 to 125,000, it's really important to keep in mind that the last 4 years has seen the complete decimation of the refugee resettlement program across the globe. That's from the local pieces of that all the way to the international pieces. I imagine Liz will maybe talk a bit more about that. That's from reopening processing centers, offices overseas, increasing the number of admission officers. All of that work has been dismantled and has to be rebuilt. And that is not going to happen despite the desire to have 125,000 people. That's more of a statement of hope, and it hasn't actually been set yet. But I think we need to be realistic about what that actually means. So we are in an immensely challenging time right now. Refugees and asylees have been profoundly politicized, as we just heard. This was once a very bipartisan topic, refugees and immigrants, and it has become tragically politicized in pretty cynical ways. I can tell you that at JFS, beyond just straight on anti-Semitism, the only other thing that I usually get pretty strong hate messages about are our work with our refugee and immigration policies. So the question oftentimes is like, well, why do we bother doing this? And I think it's exactly what Rabbi Borden just shared. We're going to celebrate Passover in a couple of weeks. The thing that I am most worried about when I look to the future generations is, will we remember our story, and will we remember what it means? As a colleague of mine once shared, a former board member at Malakoff, said, you can't climb the ladder and then pull it up behind you. And I think the only way that you don't do that is by making it absolutely clear what our story is, and making sure that our children and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren understand their part in that narrative. I mean, as Rabbi Borden said, I don't think there's anybody on this call who didn't come to this country. I shouldn't say that. I should say, by and large, the vast majority of the folks on this call probably came to this country, or their ancestors did, as an immigrant or a refugee. I'm not referring to folks who are obviously biracial families who may have come in through the Atlantic slave trade. We've been doing this work at JFS for 129 years. We started doing this work as essentially helping refugees and immigrants, and that's what we continue to do today. We partner with folks not just from the first day of arrival, as we do with HIAS, but also all the way through citizenship. We work with social integration, economic integration, legal services, helping them get their green card, and again, all the way to citizenship. We're about to start a really awesome partnership with HIAS, specifically to hire a lawyer, immigration lawyer, to work with folks seeking asylum. It's important to keep in mind, those people don't receive any benefits at all. So it is up to organizations like JFS and the community itself to take care of those folks. I want to just say, and I know I have a private minute or two left here, is I believe the work that we do with refugees and immigrants is our most important work, or at least among the most important work. They're truly the most vulnerable people on the planet. They are the most vulnerable people, by and large, that come into our country. When we decided to take that risk and through the Trump administration, we certainly knew what the consequences could be. But we made that decision because we are a refugee people. This is our story. We understand this more than anybody else, probably, or at least as much. I mean, going back thousands of years. And also, refugees and immigrants tend to always be pushed to the back of the line. They're the ones that really rarely have a voice. And we felt it was really critical. I can tell you personally, I felt commanded to do this. I felt like if anything our tradition has ever taught us to do, or taught me to do, it's that you have to actually stand for something, and certainly standing when you don't know what the consequences are. But the most important thing for me, and I think this is something we are all going to have to really start thinking about, is when our children and grandchildren look back on what we did during this very divisive time, I think we need to know what our answer is going to be. And for me, that was really critical. I wanted my kids to unequivocally know why I cared about this and why I was doing it. And I want our community to know. And I think it's really important that the broader community understands why the Jewish community cares about this, because it's nice to have these great events, but if we're not actually doing something beyond just educating ourselves, I have to challenge us to say, I think we might feel good about ourselves, but there's still going to be the same amount of folks looking for a place to go. And there's still going to be people getting kicked out of their homes. And we, thank God, by and large, are not currently being kicked out of our homes. Most of us, thank God. You know, one of the things that we're going to say at that Passover Seder is, let all who are hungry come and eat. So we open our door and we say that. So the challenge I want to give each of you is, when you say that, if you're having a Passover Seder, what is that really going to mean to you? What are you actually going to do to make sure that when you probably call out to an empty street, that you do something to actually step into the street to make sure those folks who are looking for nourishment, whether that be physical, spiritual, psychological, looking for a place where they can call home, what are you going to do to help make that possible for them? Because that, to me, is the question I'm certainly going to be asking myself this year. And with that, I'll turn it over to Liz, and thank you again.
Thanks, Will. And thanks again for the invite to be here today. For those of you who are less familiar with HIAS, I wanted to just spend a quick second on that. HIAS was founded in 1881 to assist Jews fleeing pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe. 140 years later, we like to say, kind of as Will just said, that we used to help refugees because they were Jewish, and now we help refugees because we are Jewish. HIAS is one of the 9 refugee resettlement agencies that works with the federal government to welcome refugees to the United States. We also have an ever-growing international presence with offices in, I think we're up to 16 countries now, and we do a lot of on-the-ground work throughout the world to help refugees where they are as well. So pivoting from that, and kind of building on what Representative Jayapal said a few minutes ago, the new administration has a lot of work to do. There are a lot of anti-refugee and asylum policies that need to be reversed. And this needs to be done not only by the administration, but also by members of Congress. And of course, it is our job as advocates to advocate on behalf of the things that need to be done. I just wanted to do a really quick top line overview of what some of the things we have going on at HIAS that people can engage in. And I think Melanie put up above the link to our Take Action page, which is hias.org/take action. So right now we have a few ways to get involved. We have a Welcome to Congress campaign that's currently going on, and that includes sending a welcome card to your member of Congress as the 117th Congress kicks off, and an April meeting with your elected officials. So if you're part of a congregation or another group that wants to participate in this, please take a look at the Take Action page. We have a petition online asking the Biden administration to fully end the Remain in Mexico policy. There have been some really great steps taken by this administration, and we've all seen in the news over the last couple of weeks that the first individuals have been allowed to enter the United States. This needs to go even further, obviously, and be completely dismantled. And then the third thing, and what I mentioned earlier, is that the administration has indicated that they are going to increase the refugee admission ceiling, formerly called the presidential determination, to 62,500 for this year, and then for next year to 125,000. That is yet to happen, which means that a lot of refugees have seen their flights canceled, including, you know, there is a story of a pregnant woman who can no longer travel because she's going to bump up with the time that it's safe. And so we really need to ensure that this refugee admission ceiling is formally signed as quickly as possible, so to impact as few individuals as possible. HIAS is going to be sending around an action alert on that early this week. So make sure that if you're not already signed up to receive HIAS's newsletter, that you do so, and you can also do that on the Take Action page. And there will be a lot of other opportunities for advocacy throughout the next month as pieces of legislation are introduced. And also, as Will kind of alluded to, we need to rebuild the entire refugee system from the ground up. Like I just mentioned, there are 9 resettlement agencies that work with the government. We have affiliates throughout around the country. JFF Seattle is one of HIAS's. We have seen about half of our affiliates close around the country over the past 4 years. Those need to be reestablished. In addition, we have seen a lot of the refugee adjudicators, the people who would interview refugees, be reassigned to the asylum caseload, which means that a lot of people ultimately ended up leaving. We also know that there is usually a robust number of refugees in the pipeline waiting to be resettled. That means that they've been interviewed, they're cleared to be resettled to the US. That pipeline has dwindled to a very low number because refugees were not being interviewed in large numbers over the past 4 years based on all of the policies that were put into place. So that's also something that we're going to have to push for an increased number of circuit rides and interviews to be done so that we can have a healthy pipeline to work with in the coming years as the Biden administration allows more refugees into the United States. So watch out for more opportunities on all of those things. And I think I'll stop there for now.